I like N&W history, but I like it from the perspective of what the railroad did for its customers, not just motor power and so on like that. So the title of this presentation, I decided I was going to call it the Big Three plus a little tyke. Too bad it doesn't show up that way in your material. So ordinarily, most of the people in this room are going to think about this Big Three and a little tyke. No, that's not what I'm going to talk about, because the important thing about railroading is not the engines, it's not the track, it's not the stations, not the structures, not the agent operators. Agent operators I really enjoy. But it was the whole purpose of moving passengers, freight, express, and mail. So, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is very focused on the county that we're in. It's called Montgomery County. And this is what we're going to talk about. Well, no, we don't want to jump ahead that fast. There. Cambria Station, also known as Christiansburg. That's the last run of the Norfolk and Cincinnati East Division RPO. Postmark from it. I put the image in your presentation, which, by the way, if you don't have the presentation now, let me know. I'll make sure it gets to you. And also, too, what you have in your hands, I gave each of you a dollar bill. Doesn't look like a dollar bill. You see George Washington on it? Don't throw it away. Keep it. Give it to somebody. If you don't want it, there's going to be a box on the registration desk. Put it back in there. But by all means, if you want to keep it or if you know somebody else who wants it, please do take it. This is funded by the Railway Mail Service Library Foundation, as well as myself. These color copies are expensive. Just ask Ken Miller when you're talking about the cost of error. So anyway, let's get this party started. Okay, I ordered that one. I got to move buttons back and forth. And by the way, I want to apologize that I haven't learned since second grade how to tell time. I think Andre did a great job. In fact, he's a great segue into my presentation. He's talking about a lot of the same things that I want to reinforce. And that is, we're going to talk about these things. Now, we're talking about functions, overview of the railway mail service, functions of a railway post office. Hold up your hand if you've ever heard me or know from your own background what a railway post office was. I'm seeing some people don't have their hands up. Maybe I need to cover that little bit of a segment, okay? But I'm going to make it real quick. The nice thing about having this presentation is it makes it really easy on me. I'm going to go quickly. I'm not going to read slides. We're going to talk with you. We're going to have a discussion. If there's anything that you want to know, that's why the presentation's there to take with you. You've got that information for yourself for the future. So, those are the topics. We're going to talk then briefly, since about half of you all don't know what the Railway Mail Service and Railway Post Office was. Let's see, there was really no emblem for the Railway Mail Service. It was the Eagle badge that clerks started wearing after 1899 that sort of became the emblem. And the clerks wore it very proudly. They switched over in the 1960s to photo identification badges. You can find clerks on the last run of the New York and Washington in 1977. They got the badge on. It was a great source of pride. So, talk very briefly, and I mean briefly, about the Railway Mail Service. First RPO was an experimental service in 1862 between Hannibal and St. Joseph, what later became Burlington. It was a Hannibal and St. Joseph Railway, Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad. It's not really considered to be the beginning of the Railway Mail Service because it was a little different. It only sorted mail by one person going westbound to make a connection with the stage route at St. Joseph. Didn't sort mail on the way back, didn't sort mail for towns in between. So, and it only lasted for about 9 months. But It's in railway post office history for that reason, because they were trying it out. Some people were trying to contend that that was the first railway post office. I'll leave it to others to dispute, to discuss whether that is, but for sure, in 1864, between Chicago and Clinton, Illinois, the first real railway post office was established. And remarkably similar concept to what lasted for about 117 years after that. Now, a lot of people are going to think, oh yeah, you know, railway post offices, they're gone now. Was that successful? Well, in its era it was. Were dinosaurs successful because they existed for millions a year? The point I'm making is that anything that lasts 117 years worked pretty darn well and served the American public extremely well. And how many things that we do today are going to be around 117 years from now? I mean, we're changing technology every month, it seems like. So, very, very changing times, but the railway mail service was very important. It was basically considered to be the backbone of the post office department. A lot of the clerks considered themselves to be the Marines of the Postal Service. Everybody loves to be Marines. They get out and get the job done. Okay. Last run was in 1977. Now, just as a parenthetical, I like to throw this ringer in. It wasn't really the last railway post office. Last railway post office was a boat on Lake Winnipesaukee that was discontinued on September 30th, 1978. They just happened to call boats RPOs, even though there wasn't any tracks underneath that boat. But the New York and Washington Railway Post Office was really the last real railway post office. Another little factoid is, if you ever see your authored kit or any of the other brands that Frank does not collect because he's only interested in brass, and they're all painted up, you buy the plastic model and it's painted for whatever road you want, no matter what the actual prototype was, you're going to see Amtrak RPOs. Oh, that upsets me. It's second only to, I grew up liking Lionel. I used to collect Lionel pre-war Owen Standard before it got out of my price range. And, you know, actually American Flyer did a whole lot better job. American Flyer of Chicago, standard gauge, O gauge, before A.C. Gilbert took it over. Although American Flyer had a very nice little moving RPO catch activity. So I guess where I'm sort of wandering off the subject is that I'm not even sure what the subject is. So anyway, railway post offices, the other thing that really upsets me more than the painting up an RPO car for Amtrak is Lionel putting railway post office on a boxcar. Oh, that's painful. So anyway, the last railway post office operated by Conrail. Okay, and in the current Conrail Quarterly, there's an article in there about the last run of the New York and Washington, for those that want to delve into that. Okay, so Railway Mail Service was renamed Postal Transportation Service. This is getting to be esoteric, I suppose, unless you really started wanting to get knee deep into this. And then it changed to the Bureau of Transportation. It kept on changing the names. Now, the reason why they changed it from Railway Mail Service to Postal Transportation Service in 1949, the Railway Mail Service was including air mail service. It was including highway post offices. There was a modal shift. I already mentioned some boats were called railway post offices. They finally woke up and decided, you know, calling everything a railway when it's not railroad, we need to just call it transportation. So that's the reason for that. Now, this is a very important slide from the standpoint of it shows you what a railway post office is doing. You can't possibly see it very well, which is one of the reasons for the handout. You look at your handout, you can see a little better detail. You can even see it better if I send you a 16 megabyte file that shows everything that's going on there. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, oh, by the way, the New York Central system, that two-tone gray,
two-tone gray team,
or
cigar band team,
lightning stripes, or whatever they were. Anyway, they were very proud of the 20th Century Limited, and they actually, in the Saturday Evening Post around 1944, started doing a series of advertising showing each car in the 20th Century Limited and what it did and how important it was. Now, they had one for the observation car, they had one for the dining car, they had one for the car that had the barber shop in it and the telephone and all this other nice stuff, you know, sleeping cars. This car, their statement was basically, no matter how much fare you were, no matter what Hollywood star you were, you could not go into this car unless you were a postal employee. It was off limits on the 20th Century Limited. You had first-class mail service on a first-class train that even pass holders could not ride. Okay? All for the cost, at the time, of 3-cent stamp. So anyway, upper right-hand corner, that's where they stored some mail in bags that was going to be sorted. Then you come down a little bit further, you see these things called pigeonholes. That's distribution cases. That's the proper terminology. 10,080 of them. Not 10,000, 1,080 pigeonholes or distribution cells for about 4 or 5 clerks to stand at and sort mail. And then you come down a little further, the heart of a railway post office is one clerk that is called the pouch man. And I say man because, yeah, they really were mostly men. And he basically controlled the flow of mail to the people who went to the Smithsonian Institution. We had registered mail. Harry Winston in New York City. $502 of postage back in the early 1950s. Sent that registered mail. We got there. You may be concerned about your mail service today. We're talking about this era, which is the whole purpose of this presentation, it's a whole different scene, 100%. So, then you come down a little further and they've got the racks, and that's where newspapers, periodicals. There was a newspaper published in Williamsport, Pennsylvania that came out weekly, I think, or maybe it was monthly, I'm not sure. Anybody remember Grits?
Yeah.
Grit. Yeah. There were clerks that would lay off. They knew when it was going to be put into the mail. Let the substitute clerks handle that. Ooh, I mean, they were bringing it in by the carload. It was hard to sort. But anyway, so you had this, the racks, and they had these overhead boxes, so you had additional separations. And then down at this end, you again had more places for mail to be stacked, either that was working or had been worked and ready for dispatch when they got to a station. So, get the correct button here. So, railway post offices, they sorted several different classes of mail. It wasn't just first-class mail. And registered mail was a very, very important one. But you even had small parcels. If they had special handling were sorted there. If it was not special handling, then that was sorted someplace else called a terminal in a stationary unit, and they put those into storage mail cars, which I want to talk about a little later in this presentation. Airmail, a lot of times in the earlier days, got diverted to railway post offices. And because there were only about 400 or so air stops in the country versus 50,000 post offices, there was a very, very good chance prior to the 1950s or early 1960s that a letter, an airmail letter, went part of the way on a railway post office, even though it went airmail. And there's cases that I've seen, and I can prove it from the postmarks on there, that it never even saw the side of an belly of an airplane. And registered mail, I talked about that. Closed pouch mail, CP, no, that's not Canadian Pacific. Closed pouch mail. Have you ever looked at a train? Let me see if I've got that coming up here. See that train there? Oh, what do you call those cars? There's 1, 2, 3 cars behind the tender, and there's the railway post office. It's a 30-foot car. And you got 2 more cars. What are those called? Yes.
Storage mail cars?
Some of them are storage mail cars. You're using the right terminology. Oh, you're making me so happy.
Railway Express car.
And Railway Express as well. Don't think that you had on a train like that much baggage. People call them baggage cars. No, get away from that terminology. There might have been 1 car for baggage, maybe half of a car for baggage, but it was not, 8 cars of baggage. Get that out of your lexicon, especially if you're a modeler trying to model trains. So let me back up here just very briefly. So, I did that one already. So the crews worked really long distances. In a full-length RPO car that's 60 feet long, there was about 8 to 10 clerks. They stood the whole distance. You had, for example, the Washington and Bristol that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. You had a crew change, Washington down to Monroe. Then you had a crew change, engine crew change at Monroe that took you into this place called Roanoke. Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jim. I need all the prompting I can get at my age. And then you had another engine crew, which I guess went from Roanoke all the way down to Bristol. I'll defer to you about that. 3 locomotive changes, locomotive crew. There was at least 2 crew changes for the train crew, the brakeman, conductor, baggage master. Those railway postal clerks did that whole 400-mile trip in 10 hours standing up. Do you want to take that job? Steady work and good pay. Back during the Depression, a lot of people did. You had doctors, you had lawyers who became railway postal clerks. You had many other people. You had teachers. They were smart enough to know how to take an exam, a civil service exam, and score highly. Now, there was also a thing called Veterans Preference, where you got 10 points added, up to 10 points, I think, and that puts you at the top of the list, even if you got a relatively lower score on the exam. So, the point is, you had some really smart people in there, and they had to do a lot of memorization. I'm going to come back to that later. And they also, it wasn't just that you were running that train for 400 miles. Before you started, you had to set the car up. You had to take all the mail in, and you started distribution even before the train left. A lot of these RPOs were making dispatches at the terminal before they left because they were working mail. So, long time. Hours of service didn't apply to them. Okay? So,
Frank,
yes.
the cruise, with like the Norfolk to Bluefield or Roanoke to Bluefield, or the Columbus to Bluefield, was that a 1-day trip? They'd spend the night, they'd come back, so there was a train going in both directions once a day, or?
Well, there's some short runs in there. Maybe when I get to a schedule, this will become a little clearer. But you, on the Columbus and Norfolk, for example, you ran out of Norfolk to Bluefield through Roanoke. You go out one direction, yes, you do a layover, and then you come back the next day.
So there were basically 2 trains
Yeah,
going each direction.
They actually had, everybody talks about in trains, you got sides. You got this side, that side for crews. It actually required 4 different crews just to cover that because you had layoffs where they do these trips where they do maybe 2 or 3 round trips with an overnight layover in a row, then they had a week off. Then they would do another round of them that take up most of the week, and then they had as much as 2 weeks off. That was one of the things that was very appealing to the clerks. And the other thing that was very appealing is They could live anywhere on the railroad line that they were working on within 4 miles. And, you know, now if you're earning a government wage and you're living in a city like Washington, D.C., or someplace it's really high cost, that doesn't really go as far as if you can go down to rural retreat, buy a house there, and be one of the richest people in town with your government pay. And when there were a lot of trains, there was plenty of trains that you could deadhead on to get back to your starting point, your head out. Okay, so that was another very attractive feature. A lot of these folks during their layoffs had other things they would do. They'd farm. Some of them would actually practice law and schedule all their court appearances for the time that they knew they were going to be on layoff. They might do tutoring, you know, if they were a teacher. There was all sorts of things. Do painting, plumbing, electrical work. These were skilled people. So they actually had 2 incomes, you know, if they wanted to be a workaholic and do something all the time. So, now, the reason why I like this particular presentation is we got some Virginian fans in here, got some N&W fans. This one takes care of both, because we're going to talk about Montgomery County and obviously the Virginian and both the N&W. The N&W and Virginian serve both of them. Anyway, you had what are called terminals. There were not any within Montgomery County. There wasn't even a terminal in Roanoke, Virginia, but that's where they sorted parcel post and newspapers, some newspapers too, as well as some unworked mail that the RPO crew could not handle. And the Virginian had a transfer clerk at Charleston. There was a transfer clerk at Roanoke. The transfer clerk supervised the transfer of mail between railway post office routes or between the railway post offices and star routes, which I can tell you what that is a little later on too. Okay, so you can read that. I don't need to tell you. Those are interesting facts. That's some more interesting facts. If you see a Norfolk and Columbus RPO cover, don't think that it's N&W. It's out in Nebraska. Okay. So now we're really getting into the meat of what I wanted to cover tonight. This is a post route map segment. Post route maps are this wide, this high, and I scan them at least 300 dots per inch. You end up with a file about 70 megabytes or so. You need that so that if you want to just snip out one county and be able to see what it is, you need that kind of resolution. Now, the interesting thing about this, and I don't really care much about pointers, but I think that's it. In 1888, you just had the N&W coming down here, and then they had this extension that started to go up the New River that goes out west.
Pocahontas.
The Pocahontas, yeah. So, all of these, every name that you see here is a post office. This map shows you how every post office was served by the Norfolk and Western Railway in Montgomery County. Mail in this era up until about the early 1960s. You mailed a letter in Montgomery County, mailed it in Blacksburg, Bradford, Christiansburg. It went by a railway post office, even though it doesn't have a railway post office postmark. Tremendously important. The N&W, as I was saying, you know, they did freight, they did passenger, mail, and express. The N&W was pivotal, at least to the counties that it operated through, for really serving the public. And for post offices, it connected every post office with the world, because you could mail an international letter. It gets processed through a railway post office, you go to a point where it's going to get changed internationally. So, parent. And also, you didn't have, you know, funeral services, a variety of organizations trying to contact you, scammers calling you every 10 minutes. You know, when the phone rang, you ran to get it because you knew it was probably important. Not so today, of course. But the point is that in that era, not a lot of people had phones. Fewer people ever sent a telegram. If you ever got a telegram, it's usually bad news. Okay. So mail was the way that they communicated with each other. Now, if you mailed a letter in Montgomery County, and it was going less than about 100, 150 miles within Virginia, it got there. Some of it actually got there the same day. If you went beyond that anywhere else in Virginia and in West Virginia, it got there the next day. All for the price of a 3-cent stamp. It's a little different today. Now you got to get an express mail envelope, and you may go to the post office when it shows up 5 days later and try to get a refund on your express mail postage. Just an entirely different world. The people today just cannot often very well conceptualize just how important mail service was. But the N&W really did bind the nation for every post office within Montgomery County. So anyway, moving along, so this is what it looked like a few years later. Back in 1939, there's this railroad called the Virginia Railway that comes on through here. And it snakes along one side of the New River up here. And some new towns pop up, and with them, some new post offices when you have a new railroad. Railroads not only transported the mail, they also created, because everything in transportation is involved with being able to access the land and be able to move. You had post offices coming and being created because of the coming of the railroad. So, unfortunately, now you'll see by 1956, a year after railway post offices were discontinued on the Virginia Railway, no more Virginian, not because the railroad didn't exist, but because it was not a mail caller. And on a post route map, only the lines that were active mail routes are shown. And there's also, if you were to go back, you can flip back and forth in your handout, if you look at the number of post offices back in 1888 versus 1956, you're going to find that there was shrinkage. This is, I had a gentleman over here that popped in here with a general scheme. Ooh, these are nice. Because that was the brains of the Postal Service and the Post Office Department. This here, you know, I'm not making assertions without referring to and utilizing primary sources. Every single post office here in Montgomery County, except for this layman, which was being served by a route from Eagle Rock to get over to Layman, everything on this page for Montgomery County shows that the Columbus and Norfolk or the Washington and Bristol supported that post office. That's a fact. So you can dwell on that when you look at your handout. And then in later years, you know, they shook it up, you know, when there was no more Charleston and Roanoke, or Page and Roanoke and Page, then you just had the two remaining routes, which are the Washington, Bristol, and Columbus and Norfolk. Now, the nice thing about this, let me see if we get over. So the Columbus and Norfolk existed between 1905 and 1962. 1962 to 1967, this postmarker was made in 1962. It changed its name because, and I'm not really good on Norfolk and Western history, but it used to be Columbus was the place where you made all the passenger connections, you know, until the 1960s. Then they decided we're going to go on over to Cincinnati and make the connections over there. That probably is worthwhile of a presentation by somebody somewhere along the way.
All the mainline trains went to Columbus until 1926.
Oh,
And that was the date that they were changed to Cincinnati.
I see. Well, not sure then how the Columbus and Norfolk continued to exist till 1962, but I'll have to look at that disconnect.
They had a connecting train there.
Okay.
Switched out of Portsmouth.
So at Portsmouth, they put the
34.
RPO there. And maybe they had a short run that went over to Cincinnati. Thank you very much, Mr. Hensley. Anyway, Bluefield, West Virginia was the split between East Division and West Division. The Washington and Bristol had no split. Now, this is a schedule. You have schemes and then you have schedules, and this is a page out of a schedule for the Columbus and Norfolk. And I'll let you again look at it. It shows that some trains had a 60-foot railway post office card, and some of them had 30 foot, some of them had 15. Now, where this becomes important to modelers is if you try to model a specific train on your layout, don't put a 60-foot car in a train that was a local that really only had a 15-foot RPM. Makes a difference. You know, I'm not a rivet counter when it comes to models, but I can tell you the difference between those cars just by looking at them. And somebody who really knows something about railway post office history would pick that up right away. Wait a second, let me go back here. There was the discussion that Mr. Andre had said. You had the trains that operated from East Radford to Walton, where they back in, or maybe you said that, Jim. So, you know, that actually was reflected in the schedules, you know, exactly how they would serve the town. Not every train was serving, in fact, it doesn't even show here on this route, Radford, but it is making a point down here that they had a closed pouch train that would back in and exchange mail. So then you get to the Virginia Railway. That existed between 1909 and 1952. And then they went around in the 1930s, they changed things to East Division, West Division, really not important to you. And then they shortened it to the Roanoke and Page, RPO, in 1952. The railway post office service on the Virginian died in 1955. And this is the schedule. Now, you look at this here in the schedule of mail routes, it goes Roanoke to Princeton. It doesn't give you a lot of detail. Sometimes you need to go to an official railway guide if you really want to get an idea of all the places that it served between Roanoke and Princeton. You'll see any place like that, flag stop, chances are they made a non-stop mail exchange there. Because at a flag stop, you don't know for sure that you're going to stop at that station, so they probably had a catcher arm picking up a mail bag off of a mail crane. And then there's the Washington and Bristol. This ought to be right up your alley. All right, 3 trains a day. It was the joint service. For a while it was named the Washington and Chattanooga. You know, you could catch a train there at Chattanooga and go on down to Atlanta, so it was an alternate from coming up from Atlanta and going up the Southern Railway all the way up to Washington, D.C. And they called those the New York trains. If you get a timetable, this is something I really don't like. The N&W was going around in the 1930s, say 3 New York trains. You see the schedule. And somehow they left out the Shenandoah Division and the no-name trains 1 and 2 that were the New York trains, as people would call them. But anyway, so there are actually 4 New York trains, but only these 3. And the Washington and Chattanooga split at Bristol. So this is a schedule that's in there. I don't need to read it to you. It's pretty busy, but you can see what the train numbers are, you know, and then where they ran, what time. And Cambria is the location for Christiansburg. Walton, the NO means no office. And then, of course, Radford. And something I didn't realize until, you know, I started visiting this area is that East Radford's not the same thing as Radford. You know, it takes a while for me to learn. Okay, now, we all, for whatever Hokies are in here, you actually, you know, this is overlooked by most postal historians of these closed pouch runs. You had a train that left behind the Cambria station at the Christiansburg station at Cambria. The Huckleberry carried mail. It was just no railway post office, no mail clerk, and all the mail from Blacksburg went by this little train. It had 3-foot space authorization, which means that it was 3 foot wide, about 5 feet deep, about 6 feet high. You can fit a lot of pouches and sacks in that amount of area. Okay. So it was in the custody of N&W baggage master. This is a schedule for it. And the death knell for that, even though the trains lasted for a while after that, is in this 1926 postal bulletin, they established a truck route that bypassed that, made a stop also at Merrimack Lines. So, summary. Summaries are always my favorite slide. Okay? The whole point of this, wanting to bring this to you, is we all like N&W history. We like Virginian history. We don't want to lose sight that the whole purpose of a railroad is serving its customers. And Uncle Sam was one of its biggest customers for a long time. I wish it was still true, but it's not. That was then, this is now. So, the important thing, since we're in Montgomery County, it really made a difference here. Every letter that was dropped in a letterbox, any of the post offices within Montgomery County, went by RPO, even if it doesn't have, when it came to mail service, until the early 1960s. So, questions? I like this even better than I think I question.
So, like in the 1950s, there was no mail moving by truck in Montgomery County.
There was, well, I won't go back to, in there, you see the post route maps. Read the post route map. You see the station like Shawsville, see Radford. You'll see little lines going from that to these other post offices or within Montgomery County. And that represents either mail messenger routes or truck routes called star routes. And so the railway post office was the way it got into Montgomery County, but then you had short distance truck transportation to get it that last mile. Okay. It was only in the 1960s that then they started relocating some of the mail processing facilities, and when they did that, they were moving them away from where railroad stations were, and then trucking became the normal means of handling mail rather than the exception. Other questions?
This is not a question, but it's a matter of trivia. I actually have had the experience of mailing letters in the RPO car. There was a time that you could do that. There was a little slot there where you could put them in. And in Bluefield, I've actually mailed on the RPO car.
I'm glad you did, because that's how I got interested in this. I started mailing letters. Now, those slots in the mid-1960s, because railway post offices are being taken out of service, and sometimes they were being used as a storage mail car where there were no clerks inside. Somebody put a letter in there, and next thing you know, 6 months later, they found the letter on the floor, and nobody did anything with it. So they went in, they welded on the inside, or tack welded on the outside, those letter slots that were still there, but you couldn't open them and put any mail there. So that's how I got into this. I had to knock on the door. The clerk came to the door. Said, I got a letter, please. Would you take it? Cool. I actually had a clerk who threw the letter back at me. I got educated a little fast. I was trying to send a newspaper or something like that, to a friend up in Caribou, Maine. And the clerk said, well, I can't take that. That's not first-class mail. Here, there. Threw it on the ground. That made an impression upon me. Go on. 60 years later, it made an impression on me. But, you know, there was a clerk down at the other door that said, oh, come on down here, give it to me. Put it in the bag, it went. But I learned my lesson. So yes, that's how I got started, Jim, you know? I would not be interested in railway post offices now were it not for the contact with the, if I was just putting the letter through the slot, it'd be a hands-off, as they say nowadays, touchless, you know, transaction. It was all about, I recognize that guy. They started recognizing me. I'm the mascot of the Washington and Florence RPO. Unfortunately, none of the clerks are still alive, but I'm still the mascot. Any other questions?
Okay, question there, I saw on the listing of where the post offices were and whatever, we had at the bottom of the sheet, had Vicar Switch. And the next one that came up was Vicar. Was it ever known as Vicar Switch, or was it always just Vicar? Because I always thought the switch was in Walton.
If you see something in that general scheme entry, that was the name of the post office. Now, there was a postmaster general who was very unpopular because of a variety of reasons. But back in the early 1900s, they got rid of switch, they got rid of apostrophe S, like Harper's Ferry became Harper's without an apostrophe. Pittsburgh, they took off the H. Oh, people in Pittsburgh didn't like that. Ooh. Next thing you know, they were one of the few places that got the H put back on. But they were doing all sorts of stuff like that, you know. This is not our first round with cost cutting, because when you're engraving a postmarker, you're paying by the letter for engraving. And that's up after a while. They were a little too cost conscious as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, so yeah, if it says that, if that's the name that you see in the general scheme, that is the name of the post office. And as I mentioned, for Walton, it says NO, no office. There's no post office at Walton. But because it was a junction point, they needed to show it in the schedule. They also, it may not be in these schedules, there's one called NJ. No, not New Jersey. That means no junction. Okay, so you might have two RPOs operating through that town, but there was no junction between them. And they were indicating that in the schedule so that you couldn't make a connection.
So in other words, at one time, it was Vicar Switch then, I guess.
Just like, there's this lady that was down in Nashville. She was from Grinders Switch.
Oh, yeah.
Minnie Pearl.
Yeah.
Minnie Pearl.
And I've seen Minnie Pearl. I saw Roy Acuff.
Sarah Cannon.
Oh man, I'll tell you what, the Opry Light now. They got this fake Minnie Pearl that stands up there and sort of does this little Mickey Mouse kind of act like she's Minnie Pearl. Oh, I hate that. I only went to the Opry one time. That was enough for me. I don't even bother to tune in for their broadcast. If it isn't National Life and Accident running the show, which, by the way, you know where the letters WSM come from?
We save millions.
We shield millions.
Sorry, Scheer.
Yeah, the insurance company.
Yeah.
National Life and Accident, you know?
Clear Channel, 650.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah. Anyway.
People would always talk about Vicar Switch, and I said, well, that's not right. It's always been Vicar now. Vicar Switch
Well,
is the name of the bar at the old Holiday Inn in Blacksburg.
Somebody did a little history.
Evidently.
Now, I want to qualify that. The name of the post office and the name of a railroad station are not always the same.
Right.
I find this all the time, and this is something I'm chasing down, not related to the railway post office, but there's this place called Boyce. And there was also a time that it was called Boyceville. And I can't find anything authoritative that says why it was changed from Boyceville to Boyce. The post office is always named Boyce. The railroad station, anytime I ever see anything about it in an employee timetable or anything, it's Boyce, except for the first 2 or 3 years that the Shenandoah Valley Railroad was built. So, you know, I'd love to find the general order or whatever it is that said, we're changing Boyce to Boyceville for this reason. Maybe someday I'll be lucky in the archives.
And what is storage mail?
Storage mail is just mail that's not worked en route. You have it bagged, it came out of a terminal where they did the mail sorting, or it came out of a mailer. It's all sacked up or in pouches. It is loaded into the car, and it's going to another point, such as Cincinnati, Chicago, whatever, going long distances usually on the trains. Very, very seldom were they opening up the storage mail car and taking mail in and out. So that's what storage mail is, and it's also called closed pouch mail. But on the side of the car, you might find storage mail. It has a little placard on it. It says U.S. Mail. If you were ever to actually see one of those that was actually used, you turn it over. It's got the diagram, the floor diagram of the car, of what's loaded in that car and where it is in the stalls. So that when they're unloading the car, they know, oh, yeah, it's Pittsburgh mail, that's Chicago.
They had the destination
That's
usually
St.
written
Louis.
on the car, that placard that was on the car.
Yeah. Of course, some cars just went straight through. Other questions? Yes?
Right. Regarding the illustration, those were on the North Carolina branch.
Yes.
Mail cranes. Does that imply there were RPOs on that line, or were there other cars with catcher arms?
No, there were no other cars with catcher arms. If you see a mail crane someplace, first of all, there were RPOs on that in the earlier days.
48, 49.
That's right. They had train also going from, you had the Lynchburg and Durham RPO, Abington, West Jefferson RPO, Abington and Todd before that. You never had a railway post office on the Saltville branch. But, you know, that was primarily an industrial lead anyway.
All those coal field runs had RPOs.
That's right, yeah. Oh,
Ken and Will up the old line on 27 and 28.
they dart into a little branch and they come back out and get on here and go up and down. The Dot and Pocahontas was one. It changed train numbers, technically, 5 or 6 times. Go into a branch and it'll come back out with a different train number, go over here, over, up. They only changed the postmarker one time, you know, for going up into all that array of locations. And then when they got to Dot, I guess Pocahontas is at the end. Which one is at the end of the line? Dot or Pocahontas?
Pocahontas.
Okay, so you get to Pocahontas, you start coming back, they change the train number going all the way back, but not the 5 or 6 different train numbers going into all the little sidelines.
Well, the Bluestone branch train had an RPO. 1 engine and 2 cars equals 18 trains. Because
Oh,
in addition to going up all the branches and back, which each time they did it, it was a different train, they went to Pocahontas more than once, but it was 1 engine and 2 cars operating for a day on the Bluestone branch,
shuttling back
and
and
it was
forth.
18 trains before they got through.
That's an interesting fact.
But the
Yeah, they
photos
ought
of
to be
that
in
train clearly show an RPO.
Oh, yeah,
The photos I have seen
it's
of
an RPO baggage.
RPO baggage.
It's a 30-foot part. The photos, it's a 30-foot
The
part.
30 on the Bluestone.
Yeah.
I have seen photos, and we might have a look at them later, but it's not clear that the North Carolina branch had RPOs on their trains.
Here's what I'll suggest. you know, there's a reason why there's a railway mail service library.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you get into getting primary source material, it's the whole reason why you have this stuff for reference. So you tell me the date, location. When I get back to Boyce or Alexandria, I'll find a snippet of a schedule, and I'll send it to you.
If you go back far enough, they had a couple of dedicated passenger trains though, before they went to the mix.
As far as I know, it was dedicated up until 51 when they cut it off.
48 and 49 was the number of that train.
Yeah.
Frank?
Used an E on the head end.
Yes.
Late, yeah.
Yeah.
So you might hold up a general scheme so people could just see what it looked like. My question to you is, each clerk on a RPO car, did each clerk have like 5 of those in his possession?
Yeah,
And how does that work?
I sort of skipped over that. I sent it over there. I can
Okay.
do show and tell a little later. But here's the deal. Each railway post office on a train was very particular in terms of what mail was sorted on by direction and by the time that that train operated. So, and one of the other things that really made Montgomery County well-served mail, they had about 3 trains roughly, you know, on the Columbus and Norfolk. Had about 3 more trains each way. I'm talking about each way. You know, on the Washington and Bristol. Yeah, all this flow coming through there. These post offices had basically as many as, you know, 12. One, two, three, 4. They had several trains that they could make dispatches to or receive mail from. It wasn't just one train a day. That made a big difference. And you know, my view for railroad operations, for passenger service, if you had 3 trains, passenger trains operating in each direction, about 8 hours apart, every part of the route had a train during the middle of the day, everything in the evening, something in the middle of the night, but everybody had some service that they could use. When they started getting down to 2 trains one day or 1 a day, and then you started getting the 3-day-a-week service, ooh, that ain't gonna work for most people. But, you know, you had that with both the Washington and Bristol, Columbus and Norfolk. They were heavy. They may not always have had the heaviest number of passengers, but that's one of the things that really created superior service for Railway Express and for mail.
23 and 24 were primarily mail trains.
Yeah, right.
Baggage.
But, you know, whether they were primarily or secondary, you know, mail is mail, and you can make a dispatch to it and receive mail from it.
But how did they use the general scheme?
So how they use the general scheme?
Is it in his pocket all the time?
No, they had to study. They had time at home, they had to study. A railway postal clerk, it's been said, had to know the distribution for 10,000 post offices in their study assignment. So going one direction, for example, without looking at the schedule. It's in the schedules, it says what mail is worked in what direction on what train, usually. It's called a distribution list. And you'll see that going in one direction, the clerks are working Ohio, Pennsylvania, or whatever, Kentucky, okay. Coming back the other way, they're working Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, DC. So you had to know the distribution going both ways. You didn't just learn it one way. You didn't learn just one state. So that's where it really became complicated. Most states had 800 or 900 post offices, some much more than that. So it took a lot of study. That's why school teachers, attorneys, doctors who learned how to study and memorize ended up doing so well in the railway mail service. So
But if you forgot something, did you grab your general scheme?
they had their general scheme and their road grip.
Yeah, okay,
They could look at it.
Yeah.
But, you know, you're sorting letters.
yeah.
These clerks, you have to see it move. It looks like a machine gun shooting letters into the distribution cells. If you spent more than 2 seconds putting a letter into a distribution cell, you're taking too long, you know. And what they would usually do is if somebody wasn't sure about a particular post office, or they weren't really sure about it being completely legible, they'd sort of shout it out. Anybody else think about it, while they're working, and, well, that's probably such and such. Go ahead and let's wrap it up. I like wrap up. Favorite stuff.
But
Okay.
the other thing that people don't seem to understand is, you weren't sorting for the individual post office, except for the ones that were on your route. Most of the time, you were making a connecting pouch.
That's exactly right.
So if you were gonna send something to the southern part of the county or Tennessee, and you were on the Norfolk and Columbus, you're gonna throw it in the pouch that's gonna get transferred here to the Washington.
And that's very true for like going to California. There's no clock on the wall. I used to like to say the clock on the wall and the officer in the hall says it's time to leave. So we've got the handout. If you didn't get a handout, let me know, I'll get it to you. Remember, that's a $1 bill. There's going to be a box on the registration table. If you don't want to keep it, and you don't know anybody else who wants it, put it back in there. I'm not going to recycle them. I know other people that I will give it to later on. And with that, I'm really glad that I could be with you today.